and welcome back. I'm always searching through sites like Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and Shop Goodwill on the hunt for not only great drum deals on vintage gear, but also for drums I can use in projects. I always tend to be on the lookout for free equipment, and although it's rare, occasionally I'll see a posting for free drums. Back in the fall of 2021, I saw a listing on Craigslist for a free drum kit, and almost immediately I reached out to the lister and tried to see if I could take them off their hands. Unfortunately, once I heard back, he had told me that they were already claimed and I'd be on the waiting list pending a no-show pickup. After a few days, I heard nothing back and moved on to hunting the next deal, until that same lister reached out again. Although the drum kit originally posted was gone, he had informed me that he found an older bass drum in his basement and it was mine for the taking and I could pick it up off his porch later that day. So sight unseen, I made the trip up to go grab the drum, and when I got to his porch, I was surprised to see a 70s era Ludwig 22x14 bass drum. At some point, someone had decided to do a quite unique finish by dripping red paint lines on top of the black wrap. I figured this would be a good project to refinish and add to my collection, as I don't actually own a 22-inch bass drum.
6 months later.
This one sat on the shelf for a while before I could get started on it, but finally after a number of months, I was able to get to work. After grabbing the drum off the shelf, I realized it was missing 6 of the T-rods and claws. I went into my stockpile of drum parts, and luckily I was able to find 6 of the older style Ludwig claws, but only 2 of the classic T-rod style tension rods. I wasn't too worried about this, because when you set up a bass drum on the floor, the 2 lugs that would be closest to the ground are not really functional with those oversized heads. So I figured I could just use standard tension rods in place of those on front and back. After finding all the parts I needed, I started by removing all the T-rods, claws, hoops, and heads off the shell. After that, I shifted my attention to unscrewing and removing all of the lugs. Luckily, everything was in good shape with the lugs, and once I had all 20 of them removed, I took off the mounting brackets for the spurs and tom post. I considered myself lucky to have both spurs because I've worked on Ludwig kits missing them before, and it's really tricky to get one in the right size and find someone who will sell it to you for a reasonable price. The tom post was missing the wing screw to tighten it down, but I wasn't too worried about that as I was positive I'd have some sort of wing screw that I could use with the right threading, even if it wasn't a correct Ludwig wing screw. There was a thin felt gasket between the shell and tom post holder, and I made sure to be careful as I removed this, using a razor blade just to make sure it wouldn't tear or rip as I was pulling it off. After I had all the hardware from the drum completely stripped, I went up to my garage to get started with removing the wrap. On a lot of drums, these wraps are attached with only a small amount of adhesive where the wrap begins and ends, and maybe near the bearing edge. But unfortunately on this drum, there was adhesive around the entirety of the shell. With such a tight bond, it forced me to use a heat gun for the entire process of removing this wrap, and I used a putty knife to pry the wrap away from the shell bit by bit. This took forever, and unfortunately I wasn't able to cleanly remove the wrap without ripping away the outermost layer of the shell in a few spots. This was a real bummer because I believe this shell is mahogany, and I would have loved to just clear coat this shell had I been able to remove this wrap and adhesive cleanly. But I moved forward with the shell, adding some wood filler to the voids and gaps in the shell where the tear out was bad, and let it dry overnight to come back the next day to begin sanding the shell. After I had the shell sanded and feeling good, I went ahead and added tape to the interior of the shell around all of the holes to prevent the finish from getting through and onto this beautiful granitone interior. I thought I would try some real dark stain first to see if I could get the wood filler to blend at all with the rich mahogany, but it didn't really look great, so I went back to sanding the shell and did another round of wood filler and sanding the next day. Once I had a nice clean blank canvas to work with again, I went ahead and taped up the shell for a second time, including the bearing edges so I could paint this shell. I struggled to settle on a color I was happy with, but I ended up choosing a pretty neutral gray that reminded me of the interior of the shell. I set up the shell on a Lazy Susan table so I could easily work with it and began with the first coat of paint. All in all, I did between 4 and 5 coats of paint before moving on to clear coating. And again, the same process just repeats, applying a coat of finish, letting it dry, and repeating again and again. With the endless amount of downtime between coats of paint and poly, I shifted my attention to cleaning up the hardware and giving it a bath in some WD-40. I've had a huge case of this for years, and if you're smart, you can save and reuse it multiple times for this sort of application. After a day or so, I was able to come back and remove all the hardware and let it dry out on some towels for another couple of days. The hardware wasn't in too bad of shape to begin with, but I did notice a little bit more pristine appearance after running it through the WD-40. While still in the process of refinishing the shell, I also took that time to work on the two hoops. These were done in a similar fashion to the shell, with the same dripped paint effect applied over the original black finish. I sanded these down to the point where it was smooth to the touch, and I wasn't really worried about having a perfectly consistent or clean look to them, because I knew I'd be repainting them in the same black finish. I had thought about trying to use wood filler to remove the original inlay groove, but after I messed around with it for a bit, I didn't see it being something that would turn out very great. So I just went ahead and applied 2 coats of paint and took a measurement for the inlay groove in the case I could find something to match cheaply online. So after nearly a dozen coats of paint and poly, and all the time waiting in between, I could finally get this shell back downstairs and begin assembling this drum. As I went through and started attaching lugs, I quickly realized that with the wrap now gone, some of the screws were bottoming out before being fully snug onto the shell. I made a quick trip to the hardware store and bought some extra washers in a similar size, and honestly just adding 1 washer to every lug screw was enough to allow me to crank down on the screws without fear of tearing out the threaded insert on the lug. I went ahead and reattached all 20 lugs, the bass drum spurs, and the tom bracket, and then shifted my attention to a couple other loose ends with this project. The reso head that came with this drum was an aftermarket Remo ebony head, and it wasn't in terrible shape, but the decal wasn't what you'd expect to see on this era of Ludwig drums. I wiped some goof off onto the surface with a paper towel to help clean up some of the dust and dirt that had built up over time, as well as the Remo stamp. After that, I used a plastic razor blade to peel away the old decal, and then went over the head one more time with the goof off to get rid of any remaining adhesive. After a few days, the parts I ordered started to show up, including this air vent grommet for the badge. I didn't show this footage of removing the badge prior, but I was able to use a countersink bit to break the flange on the original grommet. With these older style grommets, once you remove them, it's nearly impossible to reuse them, so I knew I'd have to find something different. I could have tried to order something that was the same as the original, but I found this threaded one on eBay, and although it's not the exact grommet Ludwig would have used with this badge, it was a perfect fit. Instead of needing some sort of special tool to bend and break the flange and secure it, it was threaded with a nut on the back, and this is much more practical because it's not only easier to install, but in the case I decide to do something different with the drum shell down the road, I could easily remove the grommet and reinstall the badge as many times as I need. The next part to arrive was a pair of inlay strips for the bass drum hoops. I went back and forth about what color to get, and I settled on silver sparkle, as it seemed to be a good match for the gray shell, but also could be a complementary look to a lot of different shell colors, just in the case that I ever change it. I used everyday super glue to install these, and I just made sure to use painter's tape to hold everything in place overnight while they dried, so I wouldn't lose the tight fit while the glue was still bonding. At this point, I was pretty much able to put the whole shell together again, with heads, hoops, spurs, and all the other parts. As I've grown my channel and made content on YouTube, I've been lucky to run into circumstances where people have reached out to let me know they enjoy my work. Back in the beginning of the year, one of those moments happened with a fan of the channel, and he offered that if I ever found myself needing decals for bass drums, he'd be able to make them and would be happy to send me some free of charge as a way of saying thank you for the content he's enjoyed. I was super flattered to hear this, and when I started working on this bass drum, I knew I wanted to reach out to him to help me get something for this drum. Not only did he get everything to the exact size for my head, he also sent me a number of extra decals, just in the case anything were to go wrong with the first one, or to use for future projects. I'll honor his request to remain anonymous, but want to offer an extra thank you again for your generosity on helping me out with this decal for this project. I have a separate video about installing decals on bass heads, so I won't bore you with too much of the process, but I went ahead and got this installed and could finally call this project a wrap. I recorded a few demos, but following that, I'll come back and let you know my thoughts on the project and break down the cost that went into it. Just in case anybody is interested, I used a Shure KSM32 as an overhead for this demo, and an SE Electronics V-kick right in the porthole on the bass drum. On the batter side of the bass drum, I'm using a Remo Controlled Sound Black Dot. This is the head that came with the drum when I got it, and at this point I didn't really feel like investing $50+ in a new bass drum head. For the bass drum pedal, I had a Vic Kick radial head beater striking the drum. And probably most important of all, I'm wearing New Balance sneakers for the perfect touch.
My guys wear New Balance. We all wear New Balance.
I added a couple of towels inside of the bass drum to get rid of that ring, and sure, I probably should have done a demo with it wide open, but if I'm being honest, it didn't sound great wide open, and with these heads in this room, I don't anticipate that being an application I'll use it for. Overall, I'm impressed with the sound, and one of the reasons I was so excited to add this drum to my collection is because I don't own a kit with a 22-inch bass drum. Somehow I've managed to either collect or build 6 kits, and 3 of them have 18-inch bass drums, and the other 3 have 20-inch bass drums. The 22 definitely has a lower natural tone, and it surely punches a bit more without me getting creative with effects or other processing in post to get that sound from one of my other kicks. When it comes to the overall aesthetics of this drum and the project, I think it looks pretty nice from afar, but when I get really close up, I can see some light smears and imperfections in the paint job. Also, as much as I like the neutral gray color, after I got those silver sparkle hoops on, it really made me wish that this drum was more of a navy blue. It'd be easy enough to paint it again, but for now I'll probably stick with the You Sunk My Battleship gray. Another thing I'm not crazy about is the larger T-headed rods for the tension rods. It's era appropriate, and I know it's handy to avoid using a drum key, but I hate when I see these and they're all angled randomly and not following the shape of the hoop. It's probably just me, but just one of those things I really don't appreciate with older style drums. Luckily, if it ends up bugging me in the future, it wouldn't really be a huge investment to purchase some modern style tension rods and just replace them. So now for the part everyone's really interested in, the price breakdown. I got the shell for free and had all the missing tension rods and claws on hand. I spent $12.18 on the spray paint and polyurethane, and I spent $8.69 on the grommet for the badge. Although not necessary for this project, I splurged a bit and spent $27.27 on the inlay strips for the hoops, but that was offset by getting the logo decal sent to me for free from a subscriber. So all in all, for this project, the grand total comes out to $48.14. In my opinion, that's a steal. And for how bizarre this shell looked in the beginning, and what I was able to do with minimal investment in both my time and money, I'd call this project a success. If I'm being honest, I probably won't have this drum for the rest of my life, but at a time when I've been craving something a little bigger for recording projects, this will come in handy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this project, so leave a comment down below, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. Until next time, thanks.